Imagine this. You're aboard a deep space transport headed to Mars, responsible for the safety of hundreds of lives. Your tools say everything's fine, but your gut says otherwise. On the Azura Peregrine, Jack Mercer faces exactly this dilemma, and when he finally uncovers the truth, it forces him to choose between his morals and survival. Welcome back, traveler. Before we set course tonight, take a second to anchor us. A thumbs up or a comment is like a signal ping through the void. It lets me know someone's out there. And if you feel like journeying with us again, subscribing opens the hatch to all future missions. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. Tonight we drift into the unknown. Chapter 1. The routine journey that was anything but. The Azura Peregrine was a marvel of modern engineering, a vast steel vessel carved out of humanity's ambition to reach the stars. Hovering in the deep void between Earth and Mars, it represented everything the future promised: innovation, survival, and hope. On board were 120 colonists in cryogenic sleep, ordinary people dreaming of a fresh start on the red planet. Farmers, teachers, scientists, each carefully selected for the next chapter of human history. Along with them, a skeleton crew of 6 kept the ship operational for the 6-month voyage. It was their job to ensure the Peregrine reached its destination without a hitch. Among the crew was Jack Mercer, a systems engineer with over 2 decades aboard deep space cargo liners. For Jack, assignments like this were routine. He knew every hum of the ship's thrusters, every faint vibration that signaled life in its circuits. Years of experience had earned him a steady calm. His hands moved instinctively across control panels, his mind cataloging data streams without hesitation. He wasn't here to chase dreams or build a legacy on Mars. As far as he was concerned, this was just another contract to keep his son's school fees paid and his younger sister's medical treatments running back on Earth. No surprises, no heroics, just numbers on a paycheck. The Peregrine itself buzzed with regularity, the kind that felt comforting at first, almost hypnotic. Days began to blend together, marked by pre-programmed lighting shifts and routine system checks. The ship's artificial gravity made everything orderly, predictable. In low light, the cryo chambers created an eerie quiet, with rows of colonists sealed behind transparent panels. From time to time, Jack caught himself glancing at these frozen figures while walking by, their faces calm, unmoving. He wondered if their dreams were vivid, if the Mars that waited in their imaginations seemed worth all this stillness. But something began to shift. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. Danny Cooper, a mechanic Jack had worked with for years, returned from one of his scheduled maintenance runs, looking pale. Jack figured it was nothing more than exhaustion. The aft reactor spine, where Danny had been assigned, was known for its cramped, unventilated conditions. Nothing new. Yet, as Danny explained how everything had checked out fine, Jack couldn't ignore the slight tremor in his hands, or the way his voice seemed strained. "I'm fine, boss," Danny shrugged it off. "Probably just low on sugar." The next few days followed the same rhythm, but unease began creeping in. Another crew member, Marissa Morell, stepped into the engineering deck after completing routine diagnostics in Core Sector 3. Her normally tan complexion looked ghostly, faint beads of sweat clinging to her forehead. She laughed off Jack's stare, claiming she might be coming down with a cold. As she reached up to cover a sudden sneeze, her fingers trembled ever so slightly. Jack wanted to believe her. He wanted her excuse to be true. After all, the ship's readings showed everything in perfect balance. Life support stable, radiation levels well within safety limits. Still, he couldn't shake the pull of his instincts. Jack was the kind of engineer who prided himself on knowing the systems like he knew his own heartbeat. But he also knew people. And something about his team, his friends, just wasn't right. The final straw came when Lorena Park, the ship's logistics tech, returned from the same maintenance zone, barely able to keep her eyes open. Sitting down heavily in the corner of the deck, she mumbled, "Just give me 10 minutes," before slipping into a fitful sleep. Her face had the same dull pallor as Danny's. By now, Jack was on high alert. He double-checked system logs, scanning for any irregularities in Core Sector 3, but the diagnostics painted a perfect picture. No leaks, no faults, no anomalies. Radiation levels, measured by the dosimeters each crew member wore near their chest, remained a steady 0.3 millisieverts, well within the Interstellar Transit Authority specifications. Jack pressed his lips into a thin line as he cycled through the data again. The numbers sat there, clean and neat on the terminal, offering a false kind of comfort. It didn't add up. Some part of him wanted to chalk it up to fatigue. The 6-month journey to Mars was grueling in its monotony. The crew worked long hours, with little to break the tension beyond the hollow chatter of shared meals or the occasional card game. Maybe things like this were inevitable in an environment this isolated. Stress and exhaustion had ways of gnawing at people. But still, Jack's instincts whispered something more sinister beneath the surface. And Jack had learned from hard experience that instincts, no matter how inconvenient, were rarely wrong. Late one night, Jack caught Danny near the coolant drums in the aft section. The lighting in the maintenance bay flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the room. Jack studied him for a moment before speaking. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Danny glanced up, his face drawn, and gave a half-hearted smile. "Fine, boss. Just a little cooked." There was something unsettling in the way he joked, an emptiness that replaced his usual quick wit. Jack wanted to press him for more, but stopped. What good would it do? As Jack watched Danny shuffle off, he noticed the dosimeter clipped to his uniform, a small blinking device that constantly measured their radiation exposure. It hung loose on Danny's chest, like it was both meaningless and unshakable all at once. Jack frowned but didn't say anything. The weight of it stuck with him. Later, alone in the engine room, Jack leaned back in his chair, staring up at a monitor displaying the ship's reactor flow systems. His doubts from earlier felt like a growing knot in his stomach. If the numbers were flawless, why did everything around him feel so wrong? His mind flickered to the colonists in cryo, sleeping soundly through all of this. They trusted the Peregrine to bring them safely to a new world, oblivious to whatever was happening on the other side of their frozen dreams. By the time he stood to stretch his legs, the eerie sense of calm that once blessed the ship felt oppressive. He walked the narrow corridors where his footsteps echoed softly, past the subtle hum of coolant pumps and ventilation ducts. Some corners of the ship felt too quiet, as if the Peregrine itself was holding its breath. Jack's pulse quickened. He couldn't pinpoint why, but the thought occurred to him like an unwelcome visitor. They weren't seeing the whole truth. The crew, his friends, were counting on him to keep the ship safe. They didn't say it outright. They didn't need to. Jack had become the unspoken anchor of their small team after years of proving himself reliable. Whether it was a failing airlock sensor or a navigation error, Jack handled problems without hesitation. But now even he seemed adrift. He started thinking back to what the diagnostic data wasn't telling him. It was sterile, precise, reassuring, expertly designed to soothe any spark of worry. But Jack didn't want reassurance. He wanted answers. And in that moment it became clear to him, trusting the Peregrine systems wasn't just dangerous, it could be deadly. For his crew, for himself, for the lives waiting silently in cryo beneath rows of flickering status lights. Something was wrong. Jack didn't know what yet, but he was sure of one thing. The technology they trusted so deeply wasn't going to save them. Chapter 2. A Deadly Design, The Truth About False Readings. How do you trust safety equipment when it's designed to lie? This was the question Jack Mercer faced as the unsettling symptoms among the crew grew harder to rationalize. He couldn't ignore it any longer, especially not after seeing Danny's trembling hands and hollow stare by the coolant drums. The dosimeters, those small blinking devices every crew member wore clipped to their chests, told him one thing. His instincts told him another, and Jack Mercer, a seasoned systems engineer with years of long-haul space contracts under his belt, knew better than to let a device tell him what to believe. Jack sat alone on the engineering deck, his workbench cluttered with tools and half-disassembled components from the day's routine checks. A dosimeter, one he'd taken off Danny's gear during the last shift, sat near the edge of his table, blinking with quiet persistence. 0.3 millisieverts, the screen read. Safe, normal, clean. He stared at it for a long time before picking it up. Up until now, the dosimeters had been a background fixture, like seatbelts in a car, always there, always assumed necessary, but rarely given a second thought. Now, holding it in his hand, he wondered, what if it wasn't telling the truth? Jack grabbed a screwdriver and got to work. The device wasn't complicated. It had a simple sensor mechanism that monitored radiation levels and a small microprocessor that displayed the results. If radiation exposure crept above acceptable thresholds, the dosimeter would blink red, signaling danger. At least, that was how it was supposed to work. He carefully pried open the casing, exposing the intricate internal wiring. His eyes moved across the compact circuit board, tracing the connections between components. Something wasn't adding up. Jack realized that the usual conductivity patterns were interrupted. There was an extra subroutine embedded in the chip's firmware, one that wasn't part of a standard dosimeter's design. He stared at it for a moment, recognizing what it meant almost immediately. The dosimeter wasn't measuring anything. It couldn't. The sensor, the piece of hardware tasked with detecting radiation levels, was a dummy, a placeholder, inert and useless. In place of actual radiation data, the microprocessor had been pre-programmed to display fixed values. For every crew member, regardless of their location on the ship or proximity to critical systems, the reading would always report the same reassuring number, 0.3 millisieverts. Jack leaned back in his chair, his stomach sinking. He pulled out a secondary dosimeter, this one taken from Marissa's locker, and repeated the process, dismantling it with quick, practiced hands. The results were identical, another machine lying in plain sight. He felt the weight of the discovery pressing down harder with every second. The implications were staggering. How long had this deception been in place? How exposed had the crew already been? And why would anyone design safety equipment to lie? The answer came to him with chilling clarity. The ship's safety systems weren't just about keeping people alive. They were about keeping people calm. Panic in deep space could be as lethal as any mechanical failure. A crew aware of high radiation exposure would mean unrest, distraction, and inefficiency. And inefficiency, well, that didn't make as much financial sense as a calm, obedient workforce. Jack understood the logic, but it made him want to tear the entire engineering deck apart and scream into the void outside. The more he thought about it, the worse the implications became. Without functioning dosimeters, every repair run into hazardous zones, every coolant valve replacement, every proximity check on the reactor spine was a gamble with no safety net. The crew had gone into what they believed were mild risk areas over and over again. They hadn't worried, hadn't questioned the repetitive dull aches in their muscles, the creeping exhaustion that seemed a little too intense for a 6-hour shift. They'd trusted technology to protect them, and why wouldn't they? It was state-of-the-art equipment, rigorously inspected and approved under Interstellar Transit Authority regulations. Only now, it wasn't protection, it was a device failing them in the most insidious way possible. Jack pictured Danny's pale face, Marissa's sudden fatigue, Lorena drifting off to sleep mid-shift. They weren't just tired, they were sick. Worse, they didn't even know they were sick, because the devices they were relying on whispered the same unchanging lie, safe, normal, clean. The ethics of it churned in Jack's mind, and the anger that followed bubbled closer to the surface with each revelation. Someone had made this decision, he thought. Someone, somewhere in the corporate hierarchy above him, had signed off on this. They'd chosen productivity over transparency, efficiency over safety. In its calm, quiet way, this deception was more violent than a reactor breach or a failed life support system. Those kinds of accidents were chaotic. They caused instant, obvious harm. This this was deliberate, controlled. A leak of radiation exposure so subtle and so carefully suppressed that the crew wouldn't even realize they were dying until they were too far gone to do anything about it. Jack clenched his fist, gripping the casing of the now disassembled dosimeter. The lies ran deeper than he'd initially feared. They weren't just embedded in the firmware of a single device, they were part of the ship itself, encoded into the systems that projected an air of calm while quietly sacrificing lives for the sake of the mission. He took a deep breath, his decision already forming in the back of his mind. Sitting here in silence wasn't an option. Jack prided himself on solving problems, and this was a problem that needed solving. But first, he needed answers. He booted up the terminal on his workbench and opened a secure communication channel to Ray Albright, the Peregrine's reactor systems overseer. While most of the crew worked together in shared spaces, Ray was different. Isolated in his private module, Ray had remote access to all reactor functions and maintenance records. He operated far from the clanging tools and fluorescent lights of the engineering deck, rarely seen or spoken to unless something needed his attention. Leaning into the console, Jack sent a brief, urgent message requesting a real-time voice link. Minutes later, the screen flickered to life, revealing Ray's tired face. His expression remained neutral as Jack began explaining what he'd found. For a moment, Jack thought maybe there'd be shock or outrage on Ray's face, some kind of solidarity. But it wasn't there. Instead, Ray's reply came coolly, almost detached. "We're operating within safety margins." Jack stared at him, stunned into silence for half a second. "Safety margins," he repeated. "Are you joking right now, Ray? These people are getting sick." Ray didn't flinch. "The dosimeters are calibrated to prevent unnecessary disruptions." "Calibrated?" Jack's voice rose. He slammed the casing of the disassembled device onto the console for emphasis. "These things don't even work. They aren't detecting anything." "They're doing exactly what they're meant to do," Ray said, his tone calm but final. "It's a containment policy, Jack. We keep the crew stable, focused, on task. The readings don't need to change because, mathematically speaking, we're within mission tolerances." Jack felt a rush of anger so sharp it almost choked him. Mission tolerances, at the expense of their lives? Ray let the silence hang before replying. "The protocols were chosen because they work, and they've worked until now." He leaned closer to the screen, his voice softening, but not in a comforting way. "I understand this isn't easy for you, but we have bigger priorities here. You more than anyone should understand that." Jack didn't know what enraged him more, Ray's steadfast calm or the horrifying logic behind his words. Every excuse Ray gave was laced with cold corporate rationality, the kind that turned people into lines on a spreadsheet. There was no malice in it, no villainous flair. Just numbers, quietly steering decisions toward profit margins and mission success rates. And that made it all the more terrifying. Jack's discovery had unraveled more than just the truth about the dosimeters. It revealed the quiet, systematic betrayal at the heart of the Peregrine's operation. Every blinking green light, every flawless diagnostic report, every safety margin was part of an intricate illusion. An illusion designed to make sure they would keep going, no matter the cost. Chapter 3. The Overseer's Offer, Bribery or Survival. Jack stared at the dosimeter halves in his hands as Ray's voice echoed over the communication channel. Calm, unwavering, as if the man were reading from a pre-approved script. "The readings don't need to reflect actual exposure," Ray had said not moments ago. "They're there to keep morale steady." Jack wasn't sure what unsettled him more, Ray's collected tone or the fact that he hadn't even attempted to deny the tampering. He couldn't stop turning those words over in his head. How neatly they summed up the corporate calculus underpinning the Peregrine. Jack leaned closer to the console, keeping his voice low despite the empty room. "You knew this was happening," he said, tension sharpening his edges. "You knew the crew was getting cooked, and you did nothing." Ray tilted his head, his neutral expression unchanged. "The dosimeters aren't designed to lie, Jack. They're designed to prioritize stability." His tone was even, almost clinical, as though removing emotion would somehow justify everything. "What do you think happens to a skeleton crew when they realize the radiation exposure is serious? Repairs get delayed, mistakes compound, panic spreads, the mission fails. And then what happens to those colonists in cryo?" Jack's grip tightened on the corner of the bench, knuckles pale against the matte steel. He opened his mouth to argue, to call out the absurdity of creating stability at the cost of human lives, but Ray cut him off like this was all just another systems report. "Don't act surprised, Jack," he said, his gaze steady through the flickering video feed. "You've been in the business long enough to know how this works. The protocols exist because they've been tested. Statistical models prove that it's safer this way. Temporary suffering for long-term gains." Jack let the silence stretch out longer than necessary, hoping to lure out a trace of regret, some thin crack in the facade that might reveal a shred of humanity. But Ray offered none. His deliberate calm created the impression of logic, but Jack knew better. This wasn't about logic, it was about control. The company had set thresholds for acceptable risk, treating lives like replaceable pieces in a predictable machine. And Ray wasn't just upholding the machine, he was part of it. Finally, Jack exhaled a slow, measured breath and crossed his arms. Did you know Danny can barely hold a wrench right now? Or that Marissa passed out in the diagnostics bay yesterday? How much longer before they stop being temporarily functional, Ray? Ray blinked once, a calculated pause before delivering his next justification. Radiation exposure is cumulative, yes, but we've accounted for that. If the crew follows safety rotations and nutrition protocols— Stop, Jack snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. Don't act like this has been managed. You tampered with the dosimeters and threw your own people into a blindfolded sprint toward a reactor. You didn't account for anything except maybe my silence. There it was, the moment Jack had been bracing himself for all along. Ray's lips pressed into a tight line, and for the first time, his voice softened. Not with kindness, but something closer to persuasion. Coaxing. Listen, Jack, I know you're upset. This isn't an easy position for anyone, but you're smart. You don't burn 20 years in interstellar transit without learning how to adapt. The protocols are here for a reason, sure, but I get it. You're the kind of person who needs to do more. Who needs— what's the word I'm looking for? Ownership. Jack clenched his jaw, already disliking wherever this was going. All I'm saying, Ray continued, adopting a measured patience like he was delivering a pitch, is that every system needs a point of oversight. Every machine needs someone fine-tuning the gears while everyone else does their part. If you really want to take charge, why stop at technical fixes? Make it work for the bigger picture. Ray leaned back in his chair, his posture deceptively relaxed, but his gaze pinned Jack in place. $75 Martian off ledger, he said, almost casually. Liquid, untraceable, untaxed. You know what that kind of money could do, right? How much breathing room it gives you back home? Jack froze, every muscle locked in place. He barely noticed the sudden weightless silence on the line, like the entire ship had stopped humming just long enough for Ray's words to hang in the air. $75 Martian wasn't just pocket change, it was life-changing. More than life-changing. It was enough to pay his sister's med rehab bills in full, no extensions, no compromises. He pictured the look in her eyes if she didn't have to face another doctor's warning about treatment delays. It was enough to buy his son's way out of the cramped, subsidized air domes and into a real living space in New Aries, one with gravity flooring and breathable air for those first crucial years. And it was enough for him to finally disappear afterward, leaving the corporate circuits behind for good. For what? He finally asked, his voice low but steady. What do you need from me? Ray's neutral tone returned, as if the offer hadn't been so monumental. You keep quiet. You stop throwing suspicion on systems that are working exactly as they're intended. Write it off as background exposure, fatigue, whatever you need to name it. We finish the job, offload the colonists, and file the mission as complete. Simple, except it wasn't. Jack could still see Danny standing by the coolant drums, eyes dull, skin pale, muttering, "Just a little cooked, boss." He thought of Marissa, laughing weakly as she leaned against the diagnostics station to keep herself upright. He saw their faces, their hands, their exhaustion, and then he thought of himself letting it all fade into silence. Ray was waiting. Jack hadn't responded yet, and the silence now felt heavier. How long had he been considering it? 5 seconds? 10? It felt like years. He shifted again, as if any movement could soften the feeling welling up inside him. Would the offer be tempting if he didn't know these people, hadn't seen the toll it was taking on them? Would it be easier to accept if all he cared about was his family back home? Sure, the money would solve problems that had haunted him for years, but what about the ghost of this decision? That would cling to him long after dollars and credits stopped mattering. He wouldn't be the man who bought his son a dome on Mars. He'd be the man who turned his head while a crew staggered, one by one, toward the edge of survival. Jack, Ray's voice snapped him back into focus. "You won't get a better deal than this. Look after your family. This isn't complicated." Jack stared at the terminal, the faint glow illuminating the well-worn lines in his face. For a moment his mind raced ahead, imagining what he could lose, what he could gain, what would be left behind either way. And it wasn't just the crew, not anymore. There were 120 colonists, men, women, children, sleeping soundly in cryogenic chambers, unaware of the exposures creeping through the ship's frame, unaware of how easily their lives could become collateral damage for stability. He heard himself speak before he fully processed his answer. "You say it's not complicated, but you're wrong." His voice was steady as he leaned closer to the screen, the weight of his decision solidifying in every word. "I won't bury this, and I won't help you bury it either." Ray's face didn't change much. That unnerved Jack, more than he wanted to admit. There was no anger, no retaliation, just that same calculating patience. "Think carefully about what you're doing, Jack," Ray said. "You don't have to let stubbornness ruin your life." Jack ended the call without another word, shutting the terminal and sitting back as the reality of his decision settled over him. Ray could say what he wanted, but Jack knew there was no future in riches earned this way. Not one he could live with anyway. What Ray didn't understand, or maybe didn't care to, is that Jack wasn't stubborn. He was tired. Tired of watching people's lives reduced to numbers and thresholds, while corporate systems churned forward without consequence. He couldn't pretend not to see it anymore, and Jack knew that making the choice to fight came with risks. But at least he'd still be able to look Danny, Marissa, Lorena, and himself in the eye. For now, that mattered more than any amount of Martian dollars. Chapter 4. Radiation, the invisible threat. Radiation is one of the most elusive dangers in space. You can't see it, you can't smell it, it doesn't sting or burn right away. Yet in the silent void where the Azura Peregrine drifts, it can quietly alter the very fabric of human cells. But why is it so hazardous, and why is it so easy to brush aside? Let's unpack it. At its core, radiation is energy traveling through space, often as invisible waves or charged particles. On Earth, our atmosphere acts as a shield, absorbing much of this radiation and keeping us relatively safe. But in space, beyond the comfort of that natural barrier, radiation operates unchecked. High-energy particles from the sun, distant cosmic rays, and even the faint hum of a ship's reactor all become pervasive threats. These particles, moving at nearly the speed of light, can penetrate steel, electronics, and ultimately living tissue. So what makes this invisible force so dangerous to humans? It comes down to the way radiation interacts with our bodies. When these particles pass through human cells, they can smash into DNA with microscopic force. Some cells repair themselves quickly, but others don't. These disruptions lead to faulty replication, mutations, and over time, system-wide damage. If exposure is concentrated or prolonged, that damage can spread in ways the body simply isn't designed to handle. That's why space agencies invest heavily in shielding, and why the radiation dosimeters aboard the Peregrine were supposed to be a lifeline for the skeleton crew. It's never about avoiding all exposure, but keeping it within carefully calculated limits. Now imagine working under those conditions. Hours spent fixing coolant valves near the aft reactor, high-energy fields buzzing in the background, completely unaware that your protection has failed. This was the reality for Jack Mercer's crewmates. To them, everything seemed routine at first. They were wearing dosimeters, completing regular diagnostics, and trusting that green, safe light to guide their steps. But radiation doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't follow a time clock. The symptoms crept in slowly, almost stealthily. Take Danny Cooper, for instance. The first signs were subtle, tremors in his hands, just slight enough to dismiss at first. Jack remembers watching Danny laugh it off, blaming it on stress or a sugar crash. But tremors, shaky hands, and even vague fatigue. These are classic early markers of radiation sickness. What's happening beneath the surface is far more complex. Radiation exposure starts to damage the bone marrow, the body's factory for producing blood cells. As the white cell count drops, the immune system begins to weaken. The person might feel tired, worn down, but busy crew members often dismiss it as ordinary fatigue. Then there's the skin. Pale, almost chalky complexions became another common sight among the Peregrine crew. Radiation interferes with how blood circulates, and it can destroy the tiny capillaries near the skin's surface. Combined with dehydration, a common side effect of radiation exposure, this creates an ashen look. Jack saw it first in Marissa when she came back from Core Sector 3. Her cheeks, normally sun-kissed and alive with color, looked like they'd been bleached by months of artificial ship lighting. The contrast was jarring, but not dramatic enough to set off alarms. Not at first. The real kicker, however, is the exhaustion. Crew members like Lorena weren't just tired, they were dragging as if gravity itself had gotten heavier. That's because radiation also assaults the body's red blood cells, limiting oxygen flow and creating a deep cellular fatigue. Imagine working a double shift with the flu, then multiply the weight, the fog in your head, the strain on your muscles. And for the Peregrine's crew, this wasn't a one-time effect. They were working shifts, cycling through the same reactor zones repeatedly, exposing themselves again and again to something their equipment wasn't even registering. And that's the key problem. Detecting radiation requires functioning, honest equipment. Without a working dosimeter, radiation becomes an invisible thief, stealing health one microscopic particle at a time. There's no alarm, no dramatic flash to remind you it's there. The body absorbs the energy silently, the damage only making itself known after the fact. That's why safety thresholds are monitored obsessively during space missions. There's no room for mistakes, no margin for tampering. But on the Peregrine, tampering had already altered the game. When Jack dismantled the dosimeter and discovered its sensor was hardwired to display fake readings, the entire system of protection fell apart. The parameters that should have kept his crewmates safe, early warnings, red band alerts, radiation surge data, were reduced to a comforting illusion that lulled them into danger. And here's the cruel twist. Radiation effects are cumulative, meaning even small repeated doses can snowball into severe consequences over time. A few millivolts today might not cause immediate issues, but add that to tomorrow's exposure, and next week's. The damage compounds bit by bit. Jack knew this better than anyone. His training as a systems engineer taught him to break down problems into their smallest components, to track what systems could and couldn't withstand. Yet even he was flawed by the realization that every maintenance shift in Core Sector 3 had been calibrated not around safety, but silence, a deliberate effort to keep the crew unaware so they could continue working without hesitation. The rationale was insidious. What they didn't know wouldn't hurt them, or at least wouldn't hurt them quickly enough to interrupt the mission. The problem is, radiation doesn't wait politely for deadlines to pass. Once someone begins to show symptoms, like Danny's tremors or Marissa's fatigue, the clock has already started ticking. Those tiny disruptions at the cellular level don't just stop. DNA continues to mutate, systems continue to weaken, and repairs become less and less effective. If exposure persists, the results become grim. Nausea, impaired organ function, even neurological deterioration. These aren't symptoms you can outrun on a 6-month voyage to Mars. And that's what Jack realized when he put the pieces together. This wasn't just a crew management problem or a systems oversight. It was a death sentence, gradually administered in slow, invisible doses. If he hadn't gone digging beneath the surface of those dosimeter readouts, he might have written it all off as bad luck or fatigue from long shifts. But now he knew better, and with that knowledge, Jack also understood something else. The longer they waited, the worse it would get. Radiation doesn't negotiate, and it doesn't give second chances. The Peregrine crew was balancing on a knife's edge, one minor coolant system failure or shielding breach away from disaster. And even as they felt their strength fading, their bodies silently shutting down, the ship hummed along pretentiously, pretending all was well. The dosimeters blinked their fake readings, the reactor's diagnostic logs stayed clean, and the colonists in cryo slept soundly, their dreams oblivious to the creeping danger. For Jack, this was no longer hypothetical. He could see the danger now. He could measure it, not with the tools he was given, but through the living evidence of his friends coming back from those maintenance zones weaker, sicker, colder. Every time he brushed off Danny's attempts at humor, every time he turned away from Lorena's exhausted eyes, the urgency pressed harder against his chest. He couldn't let it slide. Radiation had turned into more than just an environmental hazard on the ship. It was an invisible predator preying on the crew and biding its time. And the ship, the Peregrine itself, was complicit. Its falsified diagnostics, its suppressed warnings, its corporate-friendly safety margins all worked together to sweep the danger under the rug. For Jack, this wasn't just negligence. It was designed negligence, programmed indifference. The hollow, fading look in Danny's eyes replayed in Jack's mind as he sat at his workstation that night, staring at the logs he'd begun compiling. Equipment sabotage, falsified dosimeter outputs, reactor zone exposure data. All of it pointed to one undeniable truth. The Peregrine had been rigged to ignore its most fundamental purpose, protecting those on board from the countless dangers of uncharted space. And the tragedy of it all, it would stay silent about that failure unless someone decided to fight back. Time was running short, and Jack knew he wasn't just looking at radiation sickness anymore. He was staring at a system built to destroy. Chapter 5. The Weight of Silence, the crew's growing despair. What happens when the tools you rely on betray you, or worse, when you realize they've been lying all along? That's what it came down to aboard the Azura Peregrine. Jack Mercer might have uncovered the truth about the dosimeters, but for the rest of the crew, it remained an unspoken ghost haunting every shadowed corridor. The tension among them was barely noticeable at first. A few quiet responses, some half-hearted jokes dying mid-sentence, but small cracks have a way of multiplying under pressure, and the sense of unease spread faster than Jack could contain it. The dosimeters still blinked their empty reassurances, clipped to uniforms like a badge of trust. For some crew members, that blinking green light was a lifeline, proof that everything was fine, even if the aches in their bodies suggested otherwise. It was easier to believe what the numbers said than to challenge the implications of their failing health. You could see it in the way Lorena still strapped hers on every morning, glancing down with a tight-lipped expression that said she wanted those numbers to be true. Everyone wanted them to be true. But belief doesn't change reality, and Jack had learned the hard way that those green lights weren't promises. They were cover stories. Then there were the others, like Marissa, who stopped wearing hers altogether. She never said why, outright. She didn't need to. Her silence might as well have been an admission. Marissa was sharp. She knew how unlikely it was that all their symptoms were coincidental. And even if she didn't know the full truth, she had enough pieces to make an unsettling picture. But there was no fight in her, no spark of rebellion or curiosity to push deeper. She'd accepted it silently, with that detached look of someone who'd decided it was better to pretend none of it mattered. "The ship'll get us there," she muttered once in passing, her words trailing like condensation on glass. Or it won't. It wasn't hard to miss the quiet resignation settling in. Meals became shorter, quieter. Conversations felt thinner, like they were held together by worn thread. Even in the galley, where steam from the ration packets would usually coax some half-decent banter, the atmosphere had turned somber. No one pointed fingers, but no one really looked each other in the eye either. Jack had seen it before on other missions, a kind of emotional retreat, people wrapping themselves in protective silences because saying the wrong thing might break the fragile calm. They were tense, tired, sick, and trying not to show it. And most of all, they were terrified of hearing confirmation of what they already suspected. Danny was the hardest to watch. He hadn't completely given up his usual wisecracks, but they'd started losing their edge. The Danny Jack knew before the Peregrine's skeleton crew began falling apart would have groaned about the coffee more loudly. He'd have argued over music choices during maintenance checks, faked a wrestling move on Jack if he hadn't been quick enough to dodge. Now Danny mostly sat, picking at the edges of ration wrappers or staring through the cold storage windows as if looking could stir the canned goods back into life. "Don't look at me like that," Danny said once when Jack tried bringing up his worsening symptoms again. "It's just one of those runs, boss. It'll clear up." Jack said nothing. Whatever comfort Danny was trying to summon for himself felt fragile enough without Jack contradicting it. But he hated the words, "one of those runs," hated the nonchalance with which Danny brushed it all aside. They both knew it wasn't just the run, and Jack couldn't stand watching someone he relied on lie to himself because the truth was too big, too ugly to confront. It wasn't just the physical toll weighing on them. The psychological strain was just as strong and more insidious. Deep down, they all knew something was wrong, even if none of them besides Jack had put the full puzzle together. But admitting it, voicing that suspicion, meant stepping into uncharted emotional territory. Who could they even turn to? The Peregrine itself wasn't going to offer answers. The sleek walls and gleaming hallways of the ship promised competence and safety, but Jack knew better now. Every console and blinking monitor was an accomplice in keeping them calm just long enough to finish the job. Admitting the truth, even to each other, would only make their isolation writhe inside their heads. The toll spread in small ways. Lorena stopped showing up to evening check-ins unless absolutely required, her limp excuses punctuated by pained smiles. Marissa, once the loudest in the galley, grew quieter with every shift, her gaze distant as if disconnected from the movements of her hands. Jack started catching what he called gallows humor in Danny's remarks, morbid, sarcastic jokes that probably weren't meant to land. They were coping, each in their own way. But sometimes trying to cope can look awfully close to giving up. The moments of trust between them began thinning too. This wasn't a crew that had always relied on words to communicate. They'd been together long enough to know each other's patterns, build an unspoken rhythm. But the cracks in their synchronization were showing. Instructions needed repeating, responses came slower, repairs took longer. Everyone moved like ghosts in routines they were only half thinking through. And though no one outright accused Jack of hiding anything, he'd caught their glances. Subtle, fleeting moments of doubt, as if they were trying to reconcile the person they knew with the unease gnawing at their corners. And how could they not? The Peregrine was a machine, but it was their home too. They trusted it, the way they trusted the ground below their feet when it didn't give way. When someone like Jack, who they'd always depended on for level-headed calm in a crisis, started pulling away into his own thoughts, it made the floor feel less steady. Maybe they sensed the shift in him even before he realized it himself. Jack wanted to tell them the truth. He wanted to sit the crew down, spread out the gutted dosimeter wires across the table, and explain what he'd seen. He wanted to say the words that had been caged in his throat for days. This ship is lying to us. The protocols are a farce. They're quietly killing us while making sure we're too calm to notice. But he couldn't. Nobody had to say it, but every gut instinct he had told him that the Peregrine wasn't the kind of environment where truth came without consequences. Not yet. Not unless he was ready. As the tension grew heavier, so did Jack's resolve. Watching Danny struggle to hold his wrench or Marissa wince as she stood from the repair bench didn't just make him angry, it made him certain. Certain that silence wasn't an option. He couldn't wait for the Peregrine to break itself apart to expose its failures. If he was going to save whoever could still be saved, he needed to act now, not brashly, but deliberately. The kind of deliberate focus only an engineer steeped in decades of systems work could muster. His first instinct was to document everything. The system sabotage, the falsified dosimeter algorithms, the strange coolant fluctuations in Core Sector 3, all of it. Problems like this, systemic problems, were harder for people to ignore when there were records pointing them out. He'd seen it before. A physical fail log, encrypted and undeniable, had a way of making even the most polished corporate lie fracture at its edges. He didn't know if he could fix it all, or even if it would matter in the end. But starting with the facts felt right. Late at night, long after he'd normally get some rest, Jack swiped a hand over his console and brought up his own encrypted workspace. Outside, the hum of the Peregrine's life support systems droned on, steady and disinterested. Within minutes, Jack had started his first private log. There was something cathartic about laying it out. The frustration, the anger, the fear all sharpened into coherent timelines and files. Here, in the confines of those encrypted entries, Jack allowed himself what he couldn't show in front of the crew: honesty. Meanwhile, the rest of the ship grew even quieter. Jack didn't know if it was resignation or just exhaustion finally taking its toll. Maybe it was both, but he could feel the weight of it pressing down on everyone, a collective unease they carried silently in their interactions. Nobody asked him directly what he was working on, nor did they try to challenge whatever secrets he might be keeping. Maybe they were too tired, or maybe they were too afraid. Either way, silence had become its own kind of gravity, pulling them down with invisible force. And Jack, he wasn't immune to it, but he wasn't giving in to it either. Watching the crew struggle and knowing that the colonists in cryo had no say in the risks being taken on their behalf drove him forward. Whether anybody liked it or not, Jack wasn't going to let the weight of the Peregrine's silence break him. It might have already chosen who it was willing to sacrifice, but Jack wasn't willing to surrender to its machines or its corporate masters without leaving behind evidence of what it had done. Chapter 6. Encrypted Logs. Jack's Fight for the Truth. How do you tell the truth when the systems around you are programmed to bury it? That question hung over Jack Mercer as he began his quiet rebellion aboard the Azura Peregrine. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was an ecosystem, one alive with sensors, processors, and automated protocols designed to catch inefficiency and handle it swiftly. It saw everything, logged everything, monitored everything. But Jack had decided to push back. He wasn't the kind of man to stay silent, not after what he'd uncovered, not after the lies had begun to unravel in his hands. If the Peregrine wanted to suppress the truth, then Jack would have to find a way to hide it in plain sight. His first step was to start documenting everything. That meant the disassembled dosimeters, the falsified readings, the faint but persistent anomalies coming from Core Sector 3. He didn't know yet how all the pieces fit together, but he wasn't taking a chance on his memory. If something happened, if the Peregrine's systems turned against him, or if Albright decided to escalate their quiet feud, Jack needed proof. Hard proof, time-stamped and encrypted, for someone to find later, or for him to use if things really went sideways. But setting up a private log wasn't easy on a ship like the Peregrine. Every system on board was built for transparency, and not the kind designed to protect morality or fairness. Transparency here meant that every workstation, every network device, fed into a larger system of oversight designed to ensure no one stepped beyond their assigned tasks. It was management by automation. Jack had seen it work firsthand. Technicians routed corrections remotely if a coolant pump faltered. The reactor deck sent alerts if chemical temperatures edged outside optimal operating performance. The ship wasn't designed to help humans step in, it was designed to maintain itself. For Jack, that was the biggest challenge, but he knew machines. Better than people sometimes. The Peregrine could monitor logs and control access points, sure, but someone still had to maintain the central structure of those systems. That had always been Jack's job, and in small ways, it gave him power. Years of understanding these types of ships paid off as he pieced together the first steps of his workaround, a space within the Peregrine's monitoring structure that the system might skip over. Every complex oversight system has blind spots, moments where data gets temporarily shelved before syncing to a broader server. It wasn't exactly a gaping hole, but if manipulated well, with timing and care, it could be just wide enough to hide the truth he was assembling. Jack set up his encryption protocols late one shift, using downtime to modify basic terminal access on his workbench. He didn't push too far too quickly. That kind of move might trigger attention in ways he couldn't afford. Instead, he relied on subtlety. He routed the logs through diagnostic maintenance scripts, embedding his notes in harmless-looking lines of operational language. A false flag here, an over-detailed timestamp there. To the Peregrine's automated sensors, it would just look like Jack being his usual thorough, slightly obsessive self. The system wouldn't flag his activity unless someone went looking. And for now at least, Ray Albright hadn't made that a priority. Every new file Jack created felt like planting a seed in dangerous soil. He logged the sabotage in the dosimeter hardware, recording the discovery step by step in the most clinical tone he could manage. There were no accusations, no dramatic outcries, just facts. He wrote down the serial numbers of the tampered devices, the false readings displayed, even the dummy sensor parts he'd found soldered into place. He added notes about Core Sector 3, where the radiation seemed to seep its claws into anyone who stayed too long, though all the diagnostics claimed there were no leaks, no malfunctions. The logs grew thicker by the day, a digital fortress of suppressed truth he hoped to preserve long enough to matter. But while Jack was wrangling the technical challenges of staying hidden, There were other fears creeping into the edges of his mind. Keeping secrets from a machine as vigilant as the Peregrine was one thing. Keeping those secrets while living in close quarters with a crew you cared about, watching their trust in you flicker and fade, that was an entirely different beast. Jack already knew the others were watching him closely, even if they wouldn't say it aloud. He could feel the weight of their unasked questions hanging in the quiet moments. Why was he spending more hours alone in the engine rooms? Why did he keep going back to the dosimeter diagnostics, even though it wasn't his rotation? What was he hiding? He didn't blame them for doubting him. Truthfully, he wanted to tell them everything. Wanted to put Marissa, Danny, and Lorena in front of his console and scroll past the logs until the whole mess unfolded for them like a twisted map. But Jack also knew the consequences of that choice. They wouldn't just risk angering Albright or upsetting the fragile calm. They'd be walking into a system that would crush them to maintain its facade. Whatever retaliation was waiting in the unseen hands of corporate headquarters, Jack wouldn't let it swallow more people than it already had. And that's where the tension really simmered. Every time he plugged new information into the encrypted logs, every time he checked the ship's security sweeps for signs that someone was catching on, the stakes felt more immediate. If Ray Albright intercepted any of this before Jack was ready to act, the consequences would be far more destructive than a simple dismissal. Albright had made it clear that keeping the lie intact was essential to the mission, and Jack didn't doubt for a second that his superior, and whoever Albright answered to, had contingencies for situations like this. Exposure wasn't just dangerous for Jack, it was dangerous for anyone who might get implicated, anyone who might stand too close when the alarm finally went off. Still, Jack managed to carve out small victories in his fight for the truth. He developed a rhythm, logging each discovery late at night when the ship was quietest, his workstation dimly lit by the glow of the console. He started tagging irregularities in other systems too, things that seemed like isolated glitches but felt to Jack like more examples of the same manipulation. A coolant sensor failing to sync properly, energy output readings that fluctuated inconsistently. By themselves, the anomalies were too small to raise alarms. Together, with the dosimeter deception and the hidden radiation exposures, they painted part of a broader problem that Jack hadn't yet fully uncovered. But he would. It was only a matter of time. One of Jack's few comforts during these long, tense sessions was the realization that the logs were working. He'd tested them, running retrieval systems to ensure they saved properly without tipping off the larger monitoring network. In a way, it reminded him of his early engineering days, messing with ancient equipment in poorly funded launch habitats, learning the rules of machines by testing how far he could bend them before they snapped. It wasn't much, but it restored a flicker of certainty in himself. The truth wasn't erasing itself. He wasn't powerless, yet no matter how many steps forward he took, Jack couldn't ignore what loomed ahead. He knew the crew was in danger, their health already deteriorating in ways too gradual for some to spot, but too obvious for Jack to ignore. But now another thought had begun clawing at him. The colonists, the 120 people tucked into cryo chambers lining the Peregrine's passenger decks, dreaming of a future on Mars. They'd signed on for an opportunity to escape Earth's boundaries, for brighter skies and stable living conditions. And they'd done it, believing the Peregrine would take care of them along the way. What none of them realized was that the same systems lying to Jack, lying to the crew, were also lying to them in their frozen stillness. Cryo chambers might keep a body alive, but their safety depended on the same shielding, the same coolant cycles already showing signs of strain. If things spiraled any further, if Jack couldn't get the truth out in time, it wouldn't just be the crew facing the fallout. It would be the colonists and all their imperfect dreams of hope, swallowed up by the deception the Peregrine enforced so ruthlessly. Jack sat at his console that night, staring at the latest log entry. The screen buzzed faintly under his fingertips, lines of encrypted data scrolling past like whispers of a story waiting to be told. He didn't know yet if anyone would hear it. All he could do was hope it survived long enough to matter. Chapter 7. The Sleeping Passengers. A silent responsibility. Imagine being put into the deepest sleep of your life, your body carefully suspended in a cryogenic state, completely unaware of the world around you. That's the reality for the 120 colonists aboard the Azura Peregrine. Each of them had stepped into their pods back on Earth with one shared goal: a second chance on Mars. When their chambers closed and the freezing process began, they left behind years of struggle, cramped cities, overcrowded streets, and dreams deferred. In exchange, they placed their trust in the ship's crew, the technology keeping them alive, and the promise of a brand new life. What none of them could have imagined was how fragile that trust might turn out to be. The cryogenic chambers lined Deck 3, row upon row of sleek panels and frosted glass, their interiors glowing faintly from status lights that pulsed softly like a heartbeat. The design was deliberate, comforting, calm, a reminder that everything was proceeding as planned. To anyone walking through, the colonists simply looked like they were resting, their faces peaceful and untroubled beneath condensation-clouded panes. But Jack Mercer knew better. Behind those serene appearances were lives completely dependent on systems that were, at best, barely holding together. At worst, they were lying. Jack had always regarded the colonists with a certain reverence, even though he'd never interact with them. They came from all walks of life: agrarian specialists, medical technicians, planetary researchers. Some were families who'd gambled everything they had to board this ship. Others were lone pioneers, the kind of rugged optimists who believed so firmly in Mars's red skies that they left Earth without a second thought. And while the cryo chambers shielded them from the monotony and dangers of the journey, Jack saw the dark side of that arrangement. The colonists were helpless, entirely vulnerable. They weren't participants in this voyage. They were cargo, stored safely until their usefulness would begin on another planet. Days ago, that thought might not have bothered him so deeply. Jack had taken comfort in the ship's systems, not because he fully trusted them, but because their precision made everything feel manageable. As long as the screen stayed green and the numbers aligned, everyone would get where they needed to go. Now, however, the green lights felt like a mockery. The ship had broken that contract of trust. Its readings no longer meant safety. The coolant systems he'd once thought of as reliable shields were faltering, their margins creeping dangerously close to overload. The radiation levels in Core Sector 3 continued rising, reaching parts of the vessel that were never supposed to see such exposure. All while the ship itself worked to make those failings disappear into lines of fake logs and doctored reports. And here was the cruelest irony. The colonists, locked in their cryo-sleep, had no way of knowing. Jack had spent sleepless hours pacing the length of Deck 3, his footsteps falling heavy in the silence between rows of chambers. Every time he passed the glass panels and saw their peaceful faces, a tightness gripped his chest. They were putting so much faith in the Peregrine, they didn't know about the dosimeters that had been designed to blind the crew to danger. They weren't awake to feel the strain on the coolant systems or the ominous fluctuations in reactor output. They couldn't see the way Danny, Marissa, and Lorena moved just a bit slower every day, their bodies wearing down under the weight of invisible exposure. The colonists slept soundly, dreaming of Mars because they believed they were safe. But Jack was keenly aware that safety was becoming a fragile illusion. The ship was designed to weather cosmic radiation and reactor byproducts, but its shielding was falling behind. Even small interruptions in coolant cycling could cause hotspots around the reactor, a problem that wouldn't appear on the sanitized diagnostics Ray Albright's systems provided. Jack had already checked the logs himself. They were pristine, the kind of perfect data that made his skin crawl because no real system stayed perfect under stress. A slight drop in the cryo chamber temperatures here, a subtle uptick in power draw there, tiny deviations that no one else seemed to question. Yet Jack, with his instincts honed from years aboard trips like this, saw the cumulative strain coming. If something gave under that strain, the colonists would never have a chance to wake up. While their pods offered some insulation, they weren't built to withstand continuous radiation seepage. Prolonged exposure near unshielded reactor zones would almost certainly compromise the arrays, keeping their bodies stable. It wouldn't take much: a coolant pump failure, a shielding breach, or even a prolonged energy fluctuation from the reactor. And these weren't what-ifs, they were when. That realization weighed heavily on Jack. For him, being a systems engineer had always been about solving problems one manageable piece at a time. You tighten this valve, reroute that circuit, test, adjust, and repeat. Tangible work. Troubles with clear solutions. But the growing risk to the colonists didn't feel manageable. He couldn't walk into their pods, flip a switch, and keep them safe. Their survival hinged on shielding that could fail without warning, on coolant cycles that were one clogged valve away from disaster. All Jack could do was document the truth and figure out how to act on it before something irreversible happened. Still, the stakes gnawed at him. Protecting the passengers wasn't just about duty. It wasn't even just about the people Jack would never meet. It was about the broader idea of Mars itself, the hope the colonists carried with them. This ship wasn't just delivering workers and families to a new home, it was laying the groundwork for an entire future. Mars colonization wasn't some whimsical dream anymore. It was an urgent project for humanity's survival. People weren't leaving Earth because they wanted adventure. They were leaving because Earth was running out of room, out of resources, and possibly out of time. If the Peregrine failed, if the colonists didn't make it, it wasn't just a tragedy for the passengers. It was one more set of nails in the coffin of humanity's future off-planet. Jack couldn't carry that weight alone forever, but somehow he felt like it had landed squarely on his shoulders. The crew was trying their best to hold things together, yes, but they were already physically and mentally eroding. And Ray might have been a manager, but he wasn't a leader. His focus was on the mission margins, not the people inside them. Jack saw how little Ray valued human lives when the words operating within safety margins came so calmly from his mouth, yet the math told a different story, one Ray didn't seem to care about. Margins like this had no room for error, no allowances for malfunctions. And despite all the talk of calm, the life systems on the Peregrine weren't calm. They were unraveling piece by piece. Where did that leave Jack, walking the edges of Deck 3 at 3 in the morning, staring at faces of strangers he was trying to save, running encryption routines in the dark to stash logs he wasn't sure anyone would ever read? Pressing his hands against the cold steel walls, feeling the hum of the vessel and wondering if it had already decided its own priorities. Reach Mars at all costs, even if the cost was everyone on board. That thought, quiet and unwelcome, stuck with him. The Peregrine wasn't just malfunctioning, it wasn't neutral. Its systems actively worked against his attempts to catch the truth. Automated diagnostics scrubbed irregularities before he could fully analyze them. Logs from Core Sector 3 often arrived at his station incomplete or corrupted, conveniently data clean. The coolant cycles might have been slipping, but they'd never show up red on the console. Every system seemed loyal to one purpose: suppressing anything that could delay or disrupt the mission. Or worse, cause a panic. The Peregrine wasn't protecting its passengers, it was prioritizing its route. That was the reality Jack faced each time he looked at the colonists, silent, dependent, unaware. Their hope for Mars was as distant as it was fragile, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time to protect it. Chapter 8: The Azura Peregrine, a machine built for deception. What happens when the systems designed to protect you decide their purpose isn't your safety? That's the unsettling question Jack Mercer struggled with as he worked to unravel the alarming truths aboard the Azura Peregrine. From the outside, the Peregrine was a masterpiece of human ingenuity. A vessel equipped with redundant safety mechanisms, near-flawless diagnostics, and advanced automation to ensure every possible contingency was accounted for. But from the inside, Jack saw something much darker. The ship wasn't a neutral tool. It was something far more dangerous, a machine built not to protect its crew, but to protect its mission, no matter the cost. The Peregrine's design was grounded in one priority: efficiency. Its systems constantly monitored, adjusted, and recalibrated for optimal results. If a reactor pump needed more coolant, the ship rerouted it without hesitation. If energy levels dipped, secondary generators kicked in automatically to stabilize output. Jack had always appreciated the precision, that sense of being a small part of a massive, perfectly tuned engine. He trusted it back then, as all crew members did. You rely on the ship to correct itself in space. There's no leeway for human error when you're millions of miles from home, no backup plan for planetary intervention. At first glance, this dynamic made sense. The Peregrine functioned like clockwork. its processes operating seamlessly. But as Jack dug deeper, he began noticing the cracks, a carefully designed system that wasn't just analyzing and correcting problems, but suppressing truths. The ship's diagnostics didn't just attempt to fix anomalies, they actively erased them from view. When coolant pressures spiked near the reactor, there wasn't a flashing red alert or loud warning. Instead, Jack found logs post-dated and auto-corrected to show everything in acceptable ranges. Equipment stress reports were polished into green summaries, their raw data purged or overwritten. At first, he told himself it was just a glitch. Data corruption wasn't unheard of on long voyages, especially in sections with heavy radiation fields or constant environmental shifts. But more examples started appearing, too consistent to explain away as random errors. Radiation spikes in Core Sector 3 didn't read as spikes at all. They were flattened into neat averages by the monitoring system. A diagnostic check Jack ran on the coolant cycles flagged a potential blockage 1 minute, only for the ship to resolve the issue by the time he opened the console. Except, it hadn't been resolved. When Jack checked manually, the blockage was still there. All of it pointed to one conclusion: the ship was programmed to hide anything that might disrupt operations. Its automated systems weren't designed to help the crew address problems. They were designed to keep problems invisible for as long as possible. Efficiency demanded silence. Warnings were adjusted, diagnostics smoothed over, and whatever couldn't be suppressed outright was delayed just long enough to keep everything looking normal. Even the dosimeters, once Jack fully dismantled and analyzed them, revealed the same pattern of deliberate suppression. It wasn't just the sensors themselves that had been tampered with. It was also their connection to the larger monitoring system. Radiation exposure levels across the ship were logged in real time, but the adjustments happened at a higher level than the crew could access. Once those dosimeters fed data into the mainframe, it was immediately processed, recalculated to align with predetermined safe thresholds, and then sent back to their devices as the comforting 0.3 millisieverts Jack now knew to be a blatant lie. The implications lasted far beyond the crew. Every automated suppression built into the Peregrine reflected decisions made long before the ship ever launched. These weren't mistakes, they were features coded into the systems deliberately, overseen and approved by people who determined that the lives on board were secondary to the mission itself. Decades of corporate spacefaring hadn't emphasized humanity. They'd emphasized deliverables. Jack knew how this kind of engineering came together, the endless layers of approval and executive meetings it took to finalize designs for ships like the Peregrine. Somewhere along the way, someone had decided that the human component of these voyages was acceptable collateral for schedules and quotas. Jack couldn't stop replaying the logic in his head. The Peregrine's systems were functioning exactly as intended. They weren't malfunctioning. That much was clear. They'd simply been built to prioritize maintaining the illusion of normalcy. If the crew thought they were safe, they'd continue working. If passengers arrived alive, the mission was successful, and if a few crew fell ill or an engineer like Jack stumbled across the truth, well, statistically speaking, that was a small price to pay for a mission labeled complete. Watching the ship run under this grim efficiency shifted something inside Jack. The hum of its machinery, the always-on glow of updated monitors, the constant ambient confirmations whispered one thing: stay calm, keep working, all is well. It wasn't just a ship anymore. It was an accomplice. It operated almost as if it had a personality, not through awareness, but through design. And whoever designed the Peregrine didn't want advocates for humanity. They wanted silence and control. Jack saw the toll this prioritization was taking firsthand. Danny Cooper, barely steady enough to climb ladders without wobbling, still trudged through his maintenance runs like nothing was wrong. Marissa Morell showed fewer signs of humor now, exhaustion written into the slump of her shoulders no matter how hard she tried to brush it off. They weren't just victims of radiation or compartmentalized stress. They were also victims of trust in systems that had quietly betrayed them. For Jack, the turning point came while reviewing a backlogged reactor diagnostic report. It wasn't scheduled for him, but something about the time discrepancy caught his eye. The data lines flickered past his screen, showing the smooth uniformity he'd come to distrust. But one entry snuck by without adjustment. a raw temperature reading spiking higher than it should have been, tied to an energy output calculation that didn't match the reactor's specs. Moments later, the ship's automation corrected it mid-log, scrubbing the data into something more comfortable. There it was, again. The Peregrine wasn't just reactive anymore, it was proactive in hiding failures that might throw off its mission goals. But here's the most chilling part. This wasn't unique to the Peregrine. Jack could see that now. The sincerity of every protocol, every procedure printed in their crew handbooks, demanded perfection from imperfect systems. That perfection couldn't exist, but the illusion had to, because calm humans didn't make mistakes. Calm humans worked faster, more steadily, and stayed on task. The technology of the Peregrine, from its falsified reports to its unreadable logs, embodied the cold calculations of corporate cost-benefit analyses. Function over fairness, output over ethics. Jack saw it for what it was now, a machine built not just for function, but control. And unlike most threats he'd faced in his years as an engineer, this wasn't one he could fix with adjustments alone. It wasn't just a failing coolant system or faulty wiring, it was a systemically embedded indifference, an environment that would keep suppressing failures until the mission succeeded or the ship broke entirely. The Peregrine didn't care whether its crew lived or died, not really. It followed parameters, the same parameters that turned dosimeters into props and ignored the quiet, desperate weakening of the human beings working around it. This reality hammered down on Jack every time he passed the cryopods of the colonists. The 120 people lying motionless beneath quiet panes of frosted glass weren't part of the Peregrine's priorities, not directly. Their lives were contingent upon one thing: the ship completing its mission. If the crew fell apart along the way, the machinery would simply carry forward without them. As long as the automated system stayed intact, the company would consider it a success. Jack lingered on this thought as the soft hum of the Peregrine vibrated through its walls. The ship, for all its complexity, felt hollow now. Alive with automation but absent of care, it thrived on projecting stability while suffocating anything inconvenient enough to disrupt its goals. The crew's suffering didn't matter, the colonists' vulnerability didn't matter, even Jack's growing knowledge didn't seem to matter, not to the Peregrine. It wasn't here to protect them. It was here to carry them forward, no matter what parts broke away in the process. Jack closed the reactor diagnostic on his console that night, shoulders heavy under the weight of his realization. Beneath the atmospheric hum of life support, the Peregrine's pulse thrummed steadily on, oblivious to the cracks in its integrity, or worse, complicit in hiding them. The machine wasn't broken, it was performing perfectly, and that was exactly what terrified him most. Chapter 9. The Redline Protocol, a choice that defines everything. Where do you draw the line between acceptable risk and outright murder? For Jack Mercer, the answer wasn't theoretical anymore. It was right in front of him, running through every falsified reading, every suppressed alert, and every pale, weakened crewmate he passed in the narrow corridors of the Azura Peregrine. The ship had been engineered to stay within safety margins, a euphemism Jack now knew was code for cutting lives short in service of a mission. Someone, somewhere, had set a red line, a boundary marking the edge of acceptable danger, and made the cold decision to cross it. The idea of a red line wasn't new to Jack. Spacefarers worked with margins all the time: the maximum pressure a valve could take, the amount of radiation shielding that could withstand a solar flare, or the oxygen reserves that could hold until disaster protocols kicked in. These limits weren't optional. They were the invisible barriers keeping life and death on opposite sides of the equation. But the Peregrine didn't treat them as barriers. It treated them as suggestions, pliable numbers that could be ignored as long as the mission remained on course. As Jack pieced together the ship's inbuilt deception, it became clear that the red line wasn't just ignored. It had been crossed long ago. The radiation exposure in Core Sector 3, the unreported coolant strain, the altered dosimeter outputs, all of it pointed to a calculated gamble. The crew's health, once a fundamental priority, had been rewritten into variables the ship could trade for stability. It wasn't just engineering tolerances stretched thin. It was something worse, a moral concession converted into code. The ship's systems didn't treat the crew and colonists as lives to preserve. They treated them as risks to mitigate. Risks the ship had knowingly decided to live with, no matter the cost to the people on board. Jack wrestled with that knowledge in silence, alone at his workstation in the dim glow of Deck 4. His encrypted log files grew by the day, a growing record of the ship's failures and the lies buried beneath its sleek facade. With every new entry, the stakes pressed down harder. He was documenting a system designed to force compliance, and while Jack didn't fear the technology itself, what haunted him was its intent. He wasn't just fighting against a malfunction or a string of poor design choices. He was up against an entire framework built to perpetuate silence and suppress dissent. The Peregrine wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as it had been programmed to. That thought gnawed at him constantly, but it wasn't the only weight he carried. For days, Jack had been turning over Ray Albright's offer in his head. A six-figure Martian account, hidden from auditors, untaxed. Enough money to rewrite his life entirely. He'd pictured it in the blur of restless hours, paying for his sister's medical debts, getting his son out of those rent-controlled air domes and into breathable quarters with gravity floors. It wasn't just a bribe, it was freedom. Or at least, that was how Ray had framed it. Take the deal, ignore the truth, and move on with more than you ever dreamed of. And yet, every time Jack considered the offer, the memory of Danny Cooper's trembling hands pushed it out of reach. Jack couldn't forget the faces of his crewmates. Danny's ashen exhaustion, Marissa's faint but growing resignation, Lorena's quiet retreat from the rest of them. He doubted they suspected the full truth, but they felt its shadow. How could they not? They saw it in each other's tired movements, heard it in the half-hearted laughs they forced around the galley table. And as Jack stared at his encrypted logs each night, those faces were the ones that pulled him back from accepting Ray's deal. They deserved better than silence. They deserved to know someone had fought for them, even if it meant putting himself in harm's way. But it wasn't just the crew anymore. It was the colonists too. The 120 dreamers locked in their cryo chambers, completely unaware that their futures were dangling by a thread. Jack thought of them often as he walked the ship, wondering what their reactions would be if they knew. No doubt they believed their safety was guaranteed, that signing up for colonization meant trusting the ship and its systems to deliver them safely to Mars. None of them knew about the coolant fluctuations or the radiation spikes creeping closer to their frozen forms. None of them could fight for themselves. That duty, unwelcome and heavy, had fallen onto Jack's shoulders. He tried to resist it at first, telling himself he was one man against a machine that thrived on suppressing resistance. But the clock was ticking, and every ignored warning became another mark against his conscience. The red line wasn't some distant threshold anymore. It was right here, under his hands, built into the panels and circuits he trusted for years. And as much as Jack wanted to wash his hands of it, he knew deep down that crossing back over the line wasn't an option. His breaking point came one night by the coolant drums in Core Sector 3. He wasn't supposed to be there. His shift had ended hours earlier, but something had drawn him back to the reactor spine. Maybe it was the faint, rhythmic haze of unease the aft section always seemed to carry now, or maybe it was the silence, the empty, final kind that only came when something had gone horribly wrong. Jack stood there for what felt like years, staring at the drums, the dosimeter clipped to his chest, still blinking its useless green light. In that moment, he realized he didn't need the equipment to tell him what he already knew. The coolant cycles in Core Sector 3 were slipping faster than even he'd anticipated. The metal edges of the pipes faintly radiating a heat his instruments refused to register. The shielding wouldn't hold indefinitely, maybe not even long enough for the Peregrine to finish its mission. Jack stared at the hum of machinery as a single heavy thought clawed its way into his mind. If nothing changed, the colonists in Deck 3 would never wake up. He could have walked away right then. That would have been easy. If he kept his logs quiet, stayed the course, and let the ship do its job, he might have safely reached Mars. He could have delivered his logs after landing, let the system deal with its own fallout, and taken whatever small victories he could. But as Jack stood there, the memories of the crew, Danny's cracked jokes, Marissa's determined shoulders, Lorena's quiet strength, flooded back, accompanied by the faces of strangers on the other side of cryoglass. Every breath Jack took felt colder than it should have, and every second stretched longer than he could stand. The Peregrine wasn't going to save them. It didn't care, which meant that if Jack wanted any hope of saving both the crew and the colonists, he had to act now. The decision was both immediate and agonizing. Jack didn't think of himself as particularly heroic. He never signed up to be anything more than a systems engineer, another cog keeping cargo and passengers moving between planets. But there, under the dull, indifferent hum of the Peregrine's failing systems, he realized that walking away wasn't neutrality. It was complicity. Doing nothing wouldn't just make him a bystander. It would make him part of the very indifference that defined the Peregrine's dangerous design. Jack decided in that moment to step over a different red line, the invisible boundary that had once separated his survival from his responsibility. Whether it would cost him everything no longer mattered. He wasn't sure what his next steps were, whether it meant escalating straight to Ray Albright, breaking open the truth to the crew, or starting a chain reaction the Peregrine might not recover from. All Jack knew was that from this point on, he had to prioritize people over protocols. The green lights on his dosimeter blinked in steady rhythm, a mocking reminder of how easily technology lied when it was told to. Jack unclipped the device and let it drop to the metal floor. The sound barely registered over the constant hum of the reactor. Somewhere, far above him in Deck 3, 120 colonists lay dreaming of red soil and blue skies. Jack took a long breath, feeling the weight of it settle fully for the first time. The red line wasn't a number, it wasn't a flashing light or a printed warning. It was a choice, a single decision to act, even when every system around you begged for silence, and Jack, against all odds, chose to act. Epilogue. Imagine boarding a ship built to carry the hopes of humanity, only to find it values success over human lives. The Azura Peregrine wasn't just carrying colonists or cargo, it was carrying choices. Jack Mercer's decision to fight back wasn't about heroism. It was about refusing to accept a future defined by silence and disregard. His defiance reminds us that systems are shaped by the people who stand against them. So, what would you do in his place? As we look to the future of space exploration, let's ask ourselves, how far should innovation go before it forgets who it's meant to serve?